Our first question for you was, as an anthropologist, epigrapher, and a linguist, what originally motivated you to focus on my civilization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It became pretty clear to me when I was in high school already that my interests were gravitating towards ancient civilizations, to cultures that had ancient writing systems that recorded ancient language and history. It was Egypt to start with. I'm a Canadian as well, so I grew up in southern Ontario. The Royal Ontario Museum wasn't far away from us, and I would often spend time there in the Egyptian galleries. And I was pretty sure through high school and even into my first couple of semesters of college that I wanted to be an Egyptologist. And I figured that that's what I would do. And so some of the stuff that fascinated me was, that you could read ancient inscriptions and it was the actual words of ancient people. And so there wasn't as much guesswork involved in what it was they were saying. But I was also exposed to more, ancient civilizations and more cultures when I was in my undergraduate. I started to realize there was a lot more work that still remained to be done, a lot more that I could learn and be the major discoverer of if I worked with some of the cultures and civilizations in Central America. So Aztec hieroglyphic writing and Maya hieroglyphic writing were only just then really starting to be understood pretty well. Whereas, the Egyptian hieroglyphs were sort of figured out in the early 19th century, and there was still a lot that could be done in terms of understanding nuance. But for the most part, people had figured out all of the, really intricate details, and I could still do primary decipherment and also apply materials to ancient cultures. And so among the various things I was looking at, Maya was one of the standouts that I was really, really interested in. Another one was potentially going to be Crete, Mycenaean and Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. And I looked around for various graduate schools. I was committed to staying in Canada, and I found a very excellent program at the University of Calgary that had two people that were working with Maya hieroglyphic writing, somebody else who was working with Mayan languages. And I applied and got in. And so that was the major decider. If I hadn't gotten in there, I might have gone in to do something else somewhere else.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my
I
pleasure.
also noticed that when I was researching about you and kind of your reports and stuff like that, I found that you published like over like I would say over like 100 reports, and it was really, really fascinating and shocking to see. So as the author of so many books and articles on the ancient Maya, is there like one in particular that you found especially meaningful or interesting, and why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, to some extent, everything that we write as academics is kind of like our intellectual offspring in a way. So it's kind of like picking among your kids and telling somebody who your favorite kid is, which is, something you shouldn't always do. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't some standouts that I found like really rewarding, to me personally doing the research for a book, and then that have also been well received in the field and been really influential. And so on those metrics, the co-authored book that I wrote with a senior art historian, Andrea Stone, called "Reading My Art," published by Thames and Hudson in 2011. That's the one that stands out. I learned a lot in doing the collaboration in writing the book, which was a bit of a surprise to me because I kind of figured I had, sort of my contribution to that book was the hieroglyphs and the languages, and she was bringing to the table the iconography, the art system, and we were, trying to marry the two of them together as a general introduction to how my art and writing sort of proceed hand in hand. And just the kinds of questions that she asked about the material that I was, writing for my chapters, and vice versa, I would imagine. Just I did not really necessarily think about how what I was writing might be received by somebody that wasn't themselves interested primarily in the languages and on the hieroglyphs, but might be perceived by somebody who was interested primarily in the art or what the iconographic system was. And so it was super helpful to get those at that stage and think about them and also present right away, the most enlightening parts of it, the best evidence for why I was thinking about things the way that I was. And we've received just really, really excellent feedback on that book. A lot of people use it in their classes, and it remains in print. And so I'm very, very encouraged and happy by how that volume turned out. So that would be the one, I guess. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Our next question is your dissertation focused on classic Maya priesthood. So could you kind of explain what role priests played in my society and also what evidence helped you piece that together?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start with the second half of that first, because it's kind of material to it. it sort of fell into my lap in that the project that I was working on at a site called Comalcalco in Tabasco in Mexico. So pretty much off on the western part of the Maya distribution, right? Because it moves through southeastern Mexico into Guatemala and Belize, right? And then south to El Salvador and Honduras. And the reason I was working there is because there'd been a few inscriptions published, not very many, but the type of work that the archaeologists were doing at the site in the late 1990s promised to, penetrate behind final phase architecture and go into deep excavations. And they were likely to find, as they had at many other Maya sites, buried older monuments, buried inscriptions, etc. And my hope working in the far western part is that I would find different kinds of texts and inscriptions there than we find in the center or in the east where a lot of work had been done. So coming at it from a linguistics perspective, I was thinking, okay, this would be the part of the Maya world where the Maya are interacting with, Mihisokean speakers or Otomanguean speakers to their west, and the grammar will be a little bit different. I'll be able to talk about regional, linguistic patterns, maybe even dialects of the spoken language. None of that panned out. But what did pan out, which was fascinating, was as I was there, we excavated several of these urn burials that were associated with temples. And these weren't the burials of kings or queens or high ranking individuals. Most of the art and most of the writing we find pertains to them. But these were functionaries who were buried in the temple precincts where they worked. And we actually found several biographical texts carved on shells that would have been carried in, their toolkits, where they had, bloodletting implements, incense to offer to the gods, all kinds of other materials, codices, and paper. Most of that didn't preserve, but these short biographical texts gave us like a 12-year, year-by-year record of what this priest was doing, which gods he was praying to, what questions he was asking of them, how he was worshiping them. And that was the first time we'd ever had that kind of a, day to day, well, year by year account in the life of somebody who was obviously of elite status, but wasn't in the royal family, right? Was somebody who was a court functionary. And so putting that together with much more scattered data in different places, I was able to put together this picture of what priesthood looked like. And what emerged from that was the recognition that we've been trying to make these different divisions between the artisans who were producing Maya art, the artists, the writers who were, recording Maya books and recording Maya monuments, the sculptors, and these priests that we imagined were, tending temple complexes, probably arranging calendrical events to gather the community together. And what we came to realize was those were all the same group. So the scholars of classic Maya civilization were the trained priests. They were probably the only literate people in classic Maya civilization. And that started to cohere thanks to that one lucky find, and then a lot of work doing comparison and contrast across the Maya area. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And when I was researching, I also saw that you focus a lot about hieroglyphs. So I was wondering, do hieroglyphs, like inscriptions, do they reveal anything about Maya religious rituals and their relationships with God that can't really be known or determined from purely archaeological sites alone?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. The kind of thing that obviously comes up when I talk to my colleagues who are primarily archaeologists working in the Maya area, or primarily biologists, right, working with Maya burials and trying to infer things about the Maya from their burials and their tombs, etc. And yeah, the answer is there's many things that are simply recorded in inscriptions that wouldn't be recorded anywhere else. For instance, in the 50s and 60s, there was even a debate as to whether the Maya really had gods. Did they have a pantheon, or was it just that when the Spanish came in the 16th century, they obviously recognized that the people in the Maya area weren't Christian, right? That all had to be introduced, right? So they were pagan. And so therefore, did they just treat them like they were pagans in a way that they understood, like the Norse who had Norse gods and the Greek and Roman gods, prior to the adoption of Christianity, or was there really a pantheon, a sky god, a male, and various of his children forming certain functions? And so the debate really didn't have a lot of good evidence in support of it. Until we could actually read the ancient inscriptions and realize that, yeah, we have actually the names of some deities. We had some good indications that this temple or building was called the house of that particular deity. And then, of course, we found the priesthood as well. So, one way of thinking, right, something that's happened only in the last few decades is that now we know that there are gods. We know something about the organization of their pantheon. We know that temples and buildings were dedicated to them, that offerings were given to them on important occasions. And we know something about the people who filled these priestly roles, right? These in an ecclesiastical hierarchy that, pretty much ended with the king, who was the secular authority and the bishop, if you will, of a classic Maya center. But then you had these religious functionaries whose primary function was the propitiation of these deities, the organization of calendrically, determined ceremonies on a harvest calendar, things of that nature. So yeah, a fair bit that we've learned only thanks to the decipherment of Maya glyphs.
Mm. Okay, very interesting. You also worked as a consulting epigrapher on active digs in Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico. So what have these experiences, like these first-hand experiences, taught you about my spirituality that academic studies couldn't?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I mean, you can be a epigrapher, somebody that studies Maya hieroglyphic writing and not be actively at Maya sites. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but of course, people have been excavating in the Maya world for over 100 years. Some of the first huge digs by the University of Pennsylvania Museum, Harvard, the Carnegie Institution, Oxford University, that doesn't do digs in the Maya anymore, but did for a long time in the early 20th century. They all began digging in the 19 teens, 1920s. So there's been more than 100 years of finds. And so, the British Museum has these incredible collections of both actual monuments that came from the Maya area, but also, of course, casts of those monuments, photographs of those monuments, drawings of those monuments. And you can spend a very comfortable career just picking one of the sites and all of their records and transcribing them all and studying them with modern methodologies. One of the things that's really helped me in my work, since I worked with the hieroglyphic inscriptions and I'm working to kind of push forward our boundary of what we know from them, right? There's still signs we can't read. It's a complex hieroglyphic script, so it has hundreds of signs. Some of the rare ones haven't been deciphered yet. And lucky new finds make it possible, to decipher those for the first time. And the other clue, apart from general familiarity with all the inscriptions to figure those out, is to know Mayan languages. And so I speak four different Mayan languages and I study all of them. There's more than 30, as you may know. So it's a complex family relationship among those. And so whenever I'm at a place where there are Maya speakers, I'm working on the language in like my evenings and weekends while I'm working on my work during the days at an archaeological site. And so mingling with people that speak Maya languages, when I'm in southern Belize, it's, Mopan Maya speakers. If I'm in northern Belize or Yucatan, it's Yucatec Maya speakers, a related language. In the southeastern part of Guatemala and in Honduras at Copan, there are Chorti Maya speakers. And so getting to know their language and getting to know them, particularly in projects that I return to year after year. Eventually, I get invited to things like, the youngest daughter's quinceañera ceremony, right, when she turns 15, and I visit and I get to know the whole family, and sometimes they invite me to rituals that they undertake in their cornfields, for instance, at the beginning of a planting season or at the end of a harvest season, or on important dates like these, birthdays or celebrations. And so it just made me come to appreciate how much this, daily practice of offerings, in this case, usually to forest spirits that go by different names in different parts of the Maya area, are embedded in daily practice. And actually turns out that people do this kind of thing, offering on a daily basis. And so there's a lived practice about Maya spiritual beliefs that you might not know about, purely from books. And of course, with the 16th century conquest, a lot of the beliefs in the original pantheon and most of those deities has vanished. So the only way we can access some features of like, what did the deities and what did the relationship to the gods and to the ancestors mean to individual farmers, say, comes from the descendants of those farmers today. Obviously, it's transformed a lot. Nearly all of these people are now a Christian, right? Either Catholic or evangelical. But underneath that, particularly if they're Catholics, many of their saints are in fact slightly transformed members of the pantheon. And evangelicals, it's more like ancestors, not worshipped as such, but considered as part of almost quasi-angelic beings in some ways in those communities, with a lot of uncertainties in different places. But yeah, that's the major thing that I've come to see, just how important their religious practices and beliefs are day to day, which is a little bit harder to access purely from books, say, or purely at a remove academically. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess that leads us to our final question, which is from our research, the origins of Maya religion were quite unclear and we couldn't find evidence of a single true founder. So based on your expertise, do you have any theories about how Maya religious practices originated and developed?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I mean, like I said, due in part to the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, and of course, huge transformation of Mayan lifeways in the 500 years since then, right? So it's been 5 centuries of Christianization and then also political domination, right, by various successive governments. But even before that, in the ninth century AD, there was the collapse of southern lowland Maya civilization, the abandonment of most of these centers. And that's obviously a huge transformation that took place as well, including, as we know now, a rather catastrophic demographic collapse. Like probably 90% of the population, died probably in warfare, disease, famine, and things of that nature. So between those two bottlenecks on the high end, right, so that everything that we're reconstructing about classic Maya religious beliefs and ideas from ancient inscriptions and archaeological evidence, those have all transformed so that even though there are, well over 2 million modern Maya speakers today, none of them are living their religious lives that way, right? Those have all transformed dramatically. And similarly, as far back as we can push the evidence of Maya religion, so you may have heard about this site. It's called San Bartolo in northwestern Guatemala. It's fascinating because it has a mural program, beautifully well preserved, excavated in the early 2000s, dating back to about 100 BC. And what's important about it is that it actually shows a huge tableau of the deities involved in creation. And we know about most of these deities and their stories thanks to much later hieroglyphic inscriptions. So there's no hieroglyphs associated with that early phase, but it's enough to see that some of the key stories, like the maize god, who's a sort of self sacrificing figure whose death leads to the production not just of corn, but of all of the Maya crops, right? Like beans and squash and chocolate and so on. And the hero twins who tame the surface of the world and destroy many of the monsters, make it fit for humans to inhabit. They're all there already. So these key elements of Maya religion that continued for hundreds of years later until the collapse and then the Spanish conquest are already there at 100 BC, right? And the problem is that it's already quite formalized. A lot of the outlines are already there. And so all we can say now is that as far back as we can take Maya religion, it seems to be pretty formalized, right? And it's, 2,100 years ago. So how did it get that formalized? And our best evidence there is that if we think of these modern traditions, not so much precisely today where everybody has become Christianized, right? But in the 17th century and 18th century, there were lots of missionaries and others who recorded Maya beliefs and mythologies. And then even into the early 19th centuries, when there were still groups of Maya that hadn't been completely assimilated into local urban populations in Guatemala and Mexico, and still largely living much more similarly to how they would have done centuries earlier. A lot of these myths were recorded, right? And so that's actually the time period from which we get the Popol Vuh that you've undoubtedly heard of, right? So the so-called Quiche Maya Bible is a 17th century book from Highland Guatemala that contains some of these same narratives. Nobody could produce a book like that today because nobody's quite worshiping those deities in the same way, right? But if we gather all these Maya myths from across the Maya area, we realize that most of these people are the descendants of farmers from classic Maya times, right? Most of the population won't be descended from royalty. And so if we look at the common elements across them, we can see that having these hero twins that tame the surface of the world, having a maize god who's the self-sacrificing figure, right? These are widespread myth ideas. And so it suggests that that really formalized early Maya religion that we see depicted on the walls at San Bartolo at about 100 BC is probably what you would call, in anthropological terms, a big tradition, followed by elites and royalty and rulers that grew out of a little tradition that was probably really widespread. So ancestor worship, the culture heroes, the hero twins are a kind of quasi-deified ancestor, right? The maize god, probably all of that was, local village area beliefs that then were built up into this, pantheon and belief system that the elites had. How precisely it happened, right? And also whether it happened in a cynical way, that like early rulers found it was easier to control the populace if they said, hey, your maize god that you're already leaving offerings to, he's my great grandfather, right? So is this something like the Japanese state religion where the sun god, right, became the, ancestor of the royal line? Or was it, non-cynical? Maybe that was actually the belief system of this proximity of the royal lines to these people, and it grew up that way. Unfortunately, we can only guess at those things on the basis of comparative evidence. And you're absolutely right in your research. The origins remain, frustratingly unclear. We can talk a lot about their developments and changes and how they became formalized from that earliest evidence through the classic. And we can see how, some deities were added to the pantheon. We can see how some very different regional beliefs became solidified into one sort of like, state narrative over time. So we can see those features of evolutionary development, but the ultimate origin is still a little bit uncertain to us. Yeah, very much so.
Okay. Very, very interesting. I think that will wrap it up for today's interview. I think Xavier and I learned so much more from you, and thank you very much. I would like to thank you again, Dr. Zender, for educating us a lot more about my culture, my spirituality, and this will definitely play a crucial part in our project. So I would like to thank
Well,
you
I
very, very
appreciate that,
much. Yeah,
Owen. Thank you, and nice to meet you too, Xavier. And so, don't hesitate to follow up as if you're transcribing some of this or working on it, and you have any other questions. Be happy to answer them. Yeah,
perfect.
and
Thank
good
you so
luck on your
much.
project. You're
Thank you so
more than
much.
welcome. Yeah, take care.
Thank you, Dr. Zender. Thank you. Bye bye.